Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 20th edition of Stay at Home, a political education series from Jacobin, where almost every night at 6 p.m. Eastern, we've been chatting with a left-wing thinker about an idea, then doing a Q&A. And if you want to participate in that Q&A, you just have to log into YouTube and leave a comment for us in the chat box. So we have a really good lineup this week. Tomorrow, we have David Kalnitsky, and David will be talking about the economics of a feasible socialism. So in other words, we used to just make the argument that the barriers to constructing socialism, a society after capitalism, not just doses of socialism within capitalism, were purely political. The class opposition of capitalists, the power of the state, and so on. But then obviously with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the very self-evident problems in that model of central planning. We lived in an era when a lot of people thought that the barriers weren't just political, they were technical as well. So David's going to do a breakdown of what model of a society after capitalism could actually work, not just by our normative standards of worker control and whatnot as leftists, but at a technical level, where we might need the market, where we could have central planning in the commanding heights, and so on. So he's going to make an argument and cover a lot of ground in around a half hour tomorrow. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Then on Saturday, we have the second edition of Weekends with Michael Brooks and Anna Kasparian. And they'll be on for about an hour and a half with their weekly show. Then later in the evening at 6 p.m., we have an argument from Megan Day, a staff writer at Jacobin, who is going to make the case for people to be a part of a socialist organization. So if you're in the US, I recommend you join DSA. I'm sure Megan will as well, since she's a DSA member. But wherever you are, just know that an unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms. So Megan will be doing something slightly different, a little bit more of a tactical and strategic argument, but that should be great too. And later in the week, we'll do a rundown of the rest of the schedule. But for tonight, I'm pleased to be joined by one of my longest standing DSA comrades, someone I met when I was 17 years old. This was, a very formative experience being a part of New York City DSA for the summer between my senior year of high school and beginning of college, where I met a lot of comrades I have today, like Chris Maisano, like Maria Smart, like Frank Llewellyn and David Dualde, and a host of other people that if you're in the DSA milieu in New York especially, you might know. And back then, DSA was just a member organization of maybe 6,000 people. And obviously now we're far larger. And Chris Maisano is a big part of that. And beyond that, Chris is a editorial board member of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, the sister publication of Jacobin. And he's also a Jacobin contributing editor. Tonight, Chris will be talking about the Marxism of Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci is a thinker that has been co-opted and more often than not just kind of vaguely quoted by everyone from the evangelical right, like Jerry Falwell has summoned him from time to time, to Steve Bannon, to being used in vague ways by a lot of liberal left thinkers. Pete Buttigieg's father was actually one of his main translators, and Mayor Pete even has dropped a few Gramsci lines from time to time. But I think Chris Maisano is going to present a very different view of the totality of Antonio Gramsci's thought and why he's still a very relevant thinker who should be situated in the socialist tradition of, I think he'll argue, many of the other second and third international Marxists. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Chris. He'll break down the political thought of Antonio Gramsci and some of the background history for around 25, 30 minutes. Then we'll do a brief Q&A. In the meantime, please press like and subscribe. That's how we get these videos out to more people. And please do participate in that question by that discussion by asking your questions while Chris is talking. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, and thank you to Jacobin and everyone involved in organizing these sessions and for asking me to speak tonight. This has been great and helping to keep me busy while I'm at home, quarantined in my apartment here in New York. So as Bhaskar said, I'm going to be talking tonight about the Marxism of Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci is perhaps the most celebrated and the most cited Marxist theorist of the last 50 or so years. Of course, he never got to enjoy his notoriety when he was still alive. His most famous works, the essays that compose the prison notebooks, were not published in Italy until the 1950s, about 20 years after his death. They were not translated into English until the 1970s, and outside of Italy, it's probably the English-speaking world that seems to be the most attracted to his body of work. If you spend any amount of time on the left in the last couple of decades, you've surely been exposed, directly or indirectly, for better or worse, to Gramsci's intellectual and political influence. Now, according to the great British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, Gramsci was not simply an important Marxist, but in his words, the most original thinker produced in the West since 1917. Very high praise indeed. Gramsci's legacy has been claimed, as Bhaskar pointed out, by a bewildering array of intellectuals and activists, and not just on the left either. Indeed, Gramsci's work has often meant all things to all people, from Stuart Hall and Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who viewed him as a tribune of a radical democracy freed from the shackles of Marxist economism, to the intellectuals around Tony Blair and New Labour, who found in Gramsci their justification for ditching their party's historical commitment to the working class and the labor movement, and even thinkers and activists on the far right, who view Gramsci as the culture war theorist par excellence. Here in the US, it's not uncommon to see Gramsci used to justify reclaiming patriotic and nationalist symbols, or to argue for a political strategy that accepts the current state of popular consciousness as a given, instead of challenging and reshaping it. So everyone, it seems, has their own version of Gramsci, shaped to fit their particular needs and uses. How is this possible? For one thing, Gramsci did much of his thinking and writing in a fascist jail cell. The incomplete nature of Gramsci's prison writings has given rise to a vast industry of academic interpretation and commentary. As anyone who's grappled with the prison notebooks can attest, his writing can often be obscure, elusive, or indirect. To a significant extent, this is because he was writing under the watchful eye of Mussolini's jailhouse censors, all the while suffering from ill health in the psychological and emotional tortures of prison life. Even so, I would argue a close reading of the prison notebooks and much of Gramsci's other work should not allow for the bewildering array of interpretations he's been subjected to over the years. So many people latched onto Gramsci in the 1970s and 1980s, I argue, because of what they wanted to read into his work, namely an impeccably Marxist justification for giving up on class politics and class struggle in favor of the fuzzy realm of culture and discourse. In that sense, the embrace of Gramsci was a symptom of the defeat of labor movements in the advanced capitalist countries and radical intellectuals' disappointment in the seeming failure of the working class to live up to the revolutionary role that history had assigned to it. In these short remarks, I'm going to make the case that Gramsci, properly understood, was a pretty orthodox and mostly unoriginal Marxist who tried to adapt Second International Marxism to the period of defeat and reaction that followed the failed post-World War I revolutions in Italy, Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere. So to that end, I'll take up three main questions. First, what did Gramsci mean by hegemony? This is probably his most well-known and misunderstood concept, and I think it's really important to establish just what he meant by it. Second, is hegemony a fundamentally cultural concept for Gramsci, as it is for many of his supposed followers? If it's not, and I'm going to argue that it is not, what exactly is the place of culture in class struggle? And then finally, what's Gramsci's approach to the particular strategic questions facing socialists in the advanced capitalist countries, what he called the West? But before we get into all that, I want to trace a brief biographical sketch to help ground our discussion of Gramsci in Gramsci's political intellectual development and also the contemporary situation in Italian and world politics. Antonio Gramsci was born in 1891 on the Mediterranean island of Sardinia. As a small child, he fell down a flight of stairs, an accident that he survived, but at the cost of a hunched back and poor health for the rest of his life. His family was extremely poor, but he excelled in school beginning at a very young age, and he sought to pursue his studies as far as he could. In 1911, he left Sardinia for university studies in Turin, which then as now is Italy's industrial center and the cradle of its labor movement. There he became active in radical politics, and he met a number of people who would become major figures later on in Italian political life, including future communist leaders Palmiro Togliatti, Umberto Terracini, and Angelo Tasca. This student milieu would later form the nucleus of a group that published the important radical newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo, which translates into English as the New Order. During World War I, Gramsci was active in Turin's socialist movement, and he honed his skills as a writer and journalist. In his role as a leading socialist politician and journalist, Gramsci sought to apply the theory and practice of Russian Bolshevism to Italy, where a massive wave of strikes and factory occupations broke out after the war. Gramsci and his Ordine Nuovo group championed the establishment of Italian Soviets and factory councils, and they attacked those elements of the Italian Socialist Party leadership who, in their view, had no strategy for turning the wave of working-class militancy that swept Turin and the country's other industrial centers into a revolutionary movement. Gramsci, Togliatti, Amedeo Bordiga, and other leading figures of the socialist left broke away to form the Communist Party, or the PCI or PC, in January 1921. Gramsci and his circle quickly established themselves as the leading figures of the new party, and they received the support of Lenin and the Communist International, or the Comintern, in their factional struggles with Bordiga and his followers. Gramsci, Togliatti, and their faction accepted the Comintern's United Front policy that was established in late 1922, which Bordiga and his followers bitterly opposed. Now, this policy focused on alliances with non-communist workers and peasants' parties with the goal of forming what was called workers' governments. Bordiga rejected the United Front, workers' governments, and fusion with the Italian Socialist Party, which by the early 20s was allying itself again with the Comintern, in favor of an extremely sectarian and centralized and insurrectionary conception of the party and of its strategic goals. So Gramsci's broader and more flexible orientation won out and pointed the party away from sectarianism and towards becoming a mass party. But still, Gramsci and his comrades failed to achieve their goal of a communist revolution in Italy. The fascists banned the communists and other opposition parties in 1926. They established a special tribunal to carry out arrest and try so-called enemies of the state, and they extinguished freedom of speech and the press. In 1926, Gramsci was arrested on 6 counts of treason and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As the prosecutor in his trial infamously declared, "We must stop this brain from functioning for 20 years. Unfortunately, they did not, and the prison notebooks he wrote until his death in 1937 continue to stand as his personal and political testament. Okay, so let's bring it back to the main discussion for tonight. So imagine you're on the set of a socialist version of Family Feud. Socialist Steve Harvey walks up to you and says, "We've talked to 100 socialists. Name an idea or concept associated with Antonio Gramsci." There's no doubt in my mind that the #1 answer would be hegemony, and that socialist Steve Harvey, not to mention the rest of your family, would be very upset with you if you said something else. The name Gramsci is by now more or less synonymous with the word hegemony. Gramsci, however, did not invent or originate this concept. It was the Russian social democratic movement, not Gramsci, which first introduced this idea to the lexicon of revolutionary socialism. It was one of the Russian movement's central strategic concepts, and it reflected its situation in a largely agrarian and feudal society. For them, hegemony was the strategic approach by which the working class would lead all of Russia's exploited and oppressed, most importantly, the peasantry, which composed the majority of the Russian population, in a political alliance to overthrow the Tsar and his state. For Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks, it was through the construction of hegemony that the working class movement in Russia would transcend workplace-based struggles, provide leadership to the people as a whole, and build a new political and economic order. But with the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the defeat of post-World War I revolutionary upheavals in the western part of Europe, Marxists had to grapple with the new realities before them. Gramsci's major innovation along these lines, in the words of Perry Anderson, was to extend the notion of hegemony from its original application to the perspectives of the working class in a bourgeois revolution against a feudal order, to the mechanisms of bourgeois rule over the working class in a stabilized capitalist society. This distinction between pre-capitalist or feudal and capitalist societies is very important in this connection. Ruling classes in pre-capitalist societies govern their populations primarily through domination and force. Under capitalism, by contrast, the ruling class maintains its leading position through a combination of coercion and consent, with the latter usually predominating, but of course with the threat of force always held in reserve for use if it's needed. Hegemony, therefore, is a synthesis of domination and leadership, and it's the means by which the working class and other subordinate groups are subjected to the rule of the capitalist class. In his essay on the intellectuals in the Prison Notebooks, and everything that I'm going to refer to from the Prison Notebooks is from this version of the Prison Notebooks. In his essay on the intellectuals, Gramsci argues that the exercise of capitalist hegemony operates on two levels. The first level is what he calls the spontaneous consent given by the mass of the people to the ruling group in society. The basis of this process, in his view, is the position and function of the ruling class, quote, in the world of production, which is to say, the economy. Now, it's not entirely clear in these passages whether this supposedly spontaneous consent is positively and freely given, or whether it's an expression of resignation among the workers and other subordinate groups. In my view, we should assume that in practice, such supposedly spontaneous consent is actually a form of passive resignation. I think that people accept the rule of capital not because they think their subordination is right or just, but because in most times and places they correctly perceive that there's no realistic alternative and that the cost of revolts is simply too high for them to pay. Sometimes, however, acquiescence does give way to rebellion. And where and when this first mechanism fails, this mechanism of spontaneous consent or resignation, Gramsci argues, the coercive apparatus of the state is used to discipline those groups who dare to challenge the leading position of the rulers. The open use of coercion, in this view, is a kind of tripwire that's activated in moments of crisis of command and direction for the ruling class. In his long section called Notes on Italian History, in that version of the Prison Notebooks I just showed before, Gramsci argues that the achievement of hegemony is a condition of winning and effectively exercising government power. This process, in his view, also has two levels or moments. The first level or moment is domination of antagonistic groups, and the second is leadership of kindred or allied groups. He argues a social group can and indeed must already exercise leadership before winning government power. This is indeed one of the principal conditions for the winning of such power. It subsequently becomes dominant when it exercises power, but even if it holds it firmly in its grasp, it must continue to lead as well. So here again, he's contrasting and separating out, making a distinction between domination and leadership. According to Gramsci, for the working class to achieve hegemony, it must constitute itself as a political party that overcomes narrowly focused trade unionism and forms a political alliance with the peasantry, which at this time was still a major force in Italian society, as well as in many other capitalist countries, including the United States at this time. For Marxists like Gramsci, the worker-peasant alliance is the key to the working class's hegemonic project. To win the peasants over to its leadership, the working class would have to make concessions to the peasantry to bind these two subordinate but distinct social groups together. So this naturally raises the question, what kinds of concessions? For Gramsci, the basis of such an alliance is, first and foremost, an economic one. Recall his argument that the leadership of the capitalist class is cemented by its position and function in the world of production. The same thing goes for the working class. Gramsci certainly does argue that what he called moral and ethical reform, in other words, a cultural reformation, is an important part of building a hegemonic alliance. But he also argues that cultural reformation presupposes a transformation in the system of economic production. In his essay on the modern prince, which is his term for the Communist Party, he argues that, and this is a quote, the intellectual and moral reform has to be linked with the program of economic reform. Indeed, the program of economic reform is precisely the concrete form in which every intellectual and moral reform presents itself. And that's the end of the quote. Hegemony for Gramsci and other Marxists of his generation was therefore primarily not a cultural project. They did not seek to make symbolic concessions to the peasants in order to rally them to their banner. They were not trying to do something like amplify peasant voices. For them, hegemony was about establishing a system of alliances in the class struggle. And the glue that would hold the workers, the peasants, and their allies together was the satisfaction of economic needs and interests. Now, Gramsci could not be clearer on this point. As he argues in The Modern Prince, and this is a quote, the fact of hegemony presupposes that account be taken of the interests and the tendencies of the groups over which hegemony is exercised, and that a certain compromised equilibrium should be formed. In other words, that the leading group should make sacrifices of an economic corporate kind. For though hegemony is ethical political, it must also be economic, must necessarily be based on the decisive function exercised by the leading group in the decisive nucleus of economic activity. And that's the end of the quote. And you can see there the repeated emphasis on the role of economic activity, the role of groups in production, and how this is the basis of their capacity to exercise political leadership. Now, despite the clarity of Gramsci's presentation on this point, many on the left and the right continue to describe hegemony as a fundamentally cultural or ideological project. Indeed, the idea is often collapsed into the concept of cultural hegemony, which is then used to emphasize the supposed primacy of narrative and discourse in politics. Take the book and website Beautiful Trouble, for example, whose chapter on cultural hegemony summarizes it as follows. And this is a quote from them. Politics is not only fought out in state houses, workplaces, or on battlefields, but also in the language we use, the stories we tell, and the images we conjure. In short, in the ways that we make sense of the world. End of the quote. Following Stuart Hall, who did so much to redefine hegemony in primarily cultural and economic terms, Stephen Duncombe, who wrote this chapter in the book, argues that Gramsci emphasized the role of, and the rest of this is a quote from Duncombe, counter-hegemonic cultures, ways of thinking and doing that have revolutionary potential because they run counter to the dominant power. For Gramsci, these cultures might be located in traditional peasant beliefs or the shop floor culture of industrial workers. For Hall, they might be found in youth subcultures like Rastafarians and punks, and even in commercial entertainment. The activist job, according to Hall, is to identify and exploit these cultural pockets, build a radical counterculture within the shell of the old society, and wage the struggle for a new cultural hegemony. And that's the end of the quote. Duncombe is quick to note that Gramsci argued the fight for cultural hegemony had to be part of an overall strategy that also incorporated struggles for political and economic power. But even this formulation, I would argue, misses the crucial point that for Gramsci, struggles for political and economic power formed the core of a hegemonic project, and that any program for cultural reformation must be subsumed into what he called the program of economic reform. What's more, what Gramsci called the ethical political dimension of political struggle has little to do with the emphasis on storytelling and communication strategy that's so common in the NGO sector today. It refers instead to the creation of an integral worldview, grounded in the workers' experiences of daily life, through a protracted process of collective political education and organization building. Now, none of this is to argue, of course, that culture is unimportant in building a hegemonic project. Far from it. The point is that culture should instead be given its proper place in socialist strategy, namely in the construction of a political party and the creation of collective political identities associated with that party. It's also the means by which, according to Gramsci, intellectuals in a more traditional sense can overcome their isolation and join with what he calls the organic intellectuals of a mass party led by the working class. Political parties and political organizations more broadly weld together the organic intellectuals of a particular social group who play a number of important roles in that process of political organization. This could include the role of what he calls the constructor, the organizer, or the permanent persuader, and not just a simple orator. Parties impart to a social group, quote, an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic, but also in the social and political fields. Such an awareness or an identity is generated, significantly, though not exclusively, through the publication of newspapers, reviews, journals, and other media outlets that function as a political organizer and educator. Such an awareness can also come from the social and cultural auxiliaries, like sporting clubs or art and theater groups and the like, that help to bind masses of working people to the Socialist Party of America, the Social Democratic Party of Germany in its heyday, or Gramsci's PC. As Gramsci argues, the capacity of dominated groups to act collectively is necessarily fragmentary and episodic. There's always a tendency of dominated and subordinated people to unify in order to solve collective problems, the most common expression of which is trade unionism. But, as Gramsci argues, this tendency is continually interrupted by the activity of the ruling groups. Subaltern groups are always subject to the activity of the ruling groups, even when they rebel and rise up. Only permanent victory breaks their subordination, and that not immediately. That's the end of the quote. One of the functions of culture and ideology, and therefore of a political party, is to counteract this basic condition of disorganization that's constantly reinforced by the everyday workings of the capitalist system. The fatalism, the passivity, the resignation that often pervades working class life is perhaps the biggest barrier to effective collective organization, and it's something that socialists need to fight against every single day. So practical strategies and tactics are therefore subjected to very, very powerful structural constraints. This also means, as Gramsci argues, that movements from below can't simply replicate the methods and the strategies of the ruling classes, particularly their use of violence for political purposes, or, as he puts it, one will fall into easy ambushes. Gramsci adopts this perspective because of the fundamental constraints set by the class structure. Because workers are preoccupied with making a living and have to work fixed hours every day, they cannot, in his words, have permanent and specialized assault organizations, as can a class which has ample financial resources and all of whose members are not tied down by fixed work. That's the end of the quote. The war of maneuver, which in Gramsci's usage is equated with a frontal military attack, is the form of struggle appropriate to the ruling class, in his view. He argues that they have the resources and the freedom to successfully employ violence against their opponents. The war of position, which he likens to a protracted siege or, say, trench warfare, is the form of struggle most appropriate to subordinate classes in advanced capitalist countries with relatively democratic and liberal states. Only politics, he argues, creates the possibility for maneuver and movement. So Gramsci does not completely reject the possibility of a decisive military contest with the ruling class. But in his view, it can only be successful as the culmination of a long process of establishing working class political leadership in society. Gramsci is concerned above all else with analyzing the mode of political struggle appropriate to what he called the most advanced states, or the capitalist countries of what he called the West. Since the war of maneuver no longer occupies a place of central strategic importance in these countries, it must be reduced, and this is a quote, in the art and science of politics, at least in the most advanced states. The complexities of civil society in the West, he argues, are like the trench systems of modern warfare, which were so prominent in the fighting during World War I, which really influenced Gramsci and everyone during that time. In this connection, Gramsci also takes issue with Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which in Gramsci's view is a reflection of Russia's particular social structure. Under Tsarism, Gramsci argues, the structures of national life, by which he means the institutions of civil society, non-state organizations are embryonic and loose and not capable of solidifying into what he called, through metaphor, trench or fortress. Therefore, an insurrectionary road to power through a frontal assault on the state could succeed in Russia. A war of maneuver was possible in what he called the East, but not in the West, where war of position, and this is a quote from him, was the only form possible, end quote, because a higher level of capitalist development allowed states to rapidly accumulate highly destructive weapons, and social structures were capable of becoming what he called heavily armed fortifications. And he's always resorting to military metaphors to describe the way that various social institutions work to encourage or counteract working class and revolutionary movements. The strategic concept of the United Front, therefore, corresponds to the slow-moving forms of warfare that prevailed on the Western Front during World War I. I think it's worth quoting at length Gramsci's famous passage contrasting the political conditions of, again, what he called the East with those found in the West. And here's the beginning of the quote. In Russia, the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relation between state and civil society, and when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch, behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. More or less numerous from one state to the next, it goes without saying, but this precisely necessitated an accurate reconnaissance of each individual country. End of the quote. One of the fundamental features of so-called Western-type states is what Gramsci called the will to conform. Pre-capitalist ruling classes tended to operate as closed castes that individuals from the lower orders could not join. If you were not born into the aristocracy, you couldn't join it, no matter how talented or capable you were. Capitalist ruling classes, by contrast, have tended to value what's been called, or what's been known as, the career open to talents. In Gramsci's words, they construct an organic passage from the other classes into their own. The bourgeois class poses itself as an organism in continuous movement, capable of absorbing the entire society, assimilating to it its own cultural and economic level. End of the quote. Gramsci often refers to this dynamic as the problem of transformism, or trasformismo in Italian, in his writings. Now, I think one should not overstate or overemphasize the extent to which working class people, particularly in the United States, can move up and enter the ranks of the upper classes. But still, the fact that this can and does sometimes happen is a very powerful source of ruling class hegemony. And I think it's rightfully something that Gramsci devotes a lot of attention to in the prison notebooks. So if the working class movement is to displace this kind of state with one of its own making, it must ground its project in the construction of a new economic order. What is involved, as Gramsci concludes in his reflections on the state and civil society, is the reorganization of the structure and real relations between men, his words, on the one hand, and the world of the economy or production on the other. To the extent that a cultural policy enters in the equation, it will, he says, above all, be negative, a critique of the past. It will be aimed at erasing from the memory and at destroying. End of the quote. Instead of accepting and manipulating the common sense of the current society, as so many theorists of cultural hegemony argue, Gramsci calls upon us to develop what he calls the good sense of the masses of people. To that end, any socialist politics worth its salt affirms the need for contact between intellectuals and the masses, a relationship which, in Gramsci's words, can make politically possible the intellectual progress of the mass and not only of small intellectual groups. Establishing a genuine, organic, and ongoing relationship with the masses of working people, I think, is the main task that socialists like us face today. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot for that presentation, Chris. I mean, that was incredibly concise overview of Antonio Gramsci's history as a Marxist and his background. So just as a reminder to everyone, we're in your Q&A. We've had one question emailed in, but if you have other questions, please do put them in the YouTube chat. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, just two plugs. One is you should read Chris's writing in Catalyst. In particular, I would recommend something from our summer issue last year, in which Chris reviewed a few books on populism. I think was probably the best overview of the new literature on populism. I don't believe it's behind a paywall now. If it is behind a paywall, please tell me in the comments and I'll unpaywall it sometime after the talk tonight. But check out that. And also, just as a reminder, our ask for this entire series is completely non-monetary. There's a few hundred people watching this tonight. We just want you to press the like button and press subscribe. We'll nag you about money in December when we're fundraising. Given how the economy is going, we'll definitely be nagging you. But for now, please just press like and subscribe. And let's see. Okay, so we'll start with one question, which is just more about historical background. Um, Now, why was there a turn to begin with to a form of post-Marxism? And the question is, why was Antonio Gramsci associated with that turn? So I'm guessing this is about the Leclau move, um, writing, and in general, a lot of the left-wing literature in the 90s. Like, what was behind that turn, and why did Gramsci? Why was he in particular so prone to being appropriated to be used this way, in a way that Trotsky or other thinkers of similar ilk were not?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think something worth really thinking through and reflecting on. As I said before, Gramsci's work doesn't really get translated into English until the 70s, and it doesn't really get widely disseminated, in the English-speaking world in particular, until the 70s and the 80s. And, this is precisely the period in which the left, the working class movement, labor movements, are starting to come under very serious attack in many capitalist countries around the world. And it's also the period in which these movements are largely defeated politically and strategically in any number of countries, including the US and the UK. The most iconic example of that, I think, probably being Margaret Thatcher's defeat of the coal miners' strike in Britain in 1984 and 1985. Now that Gramsci is kind of on the scene and more well-known in kind of radical intellectual circles during this time, he is someone that talks a lot about culture and ideology in his works. And he talks about the need in many cases to, say, overcome the limitations of narrow forms of trade unionism and, what he calls and what many Marxists over the years have called the problem of economism. I think his discussions of all these various things, whether it's popular culture or ideology or the problems of economism, created, I think, an opening for people who may have been, say, dispirited or disappointed by the various defeats that the left and the labor movement suffered in this period, to look for ways of explaining the reasons for this defeat and the reasons for why the working class in, say, Britain or the other countries of Western Europe or the US, hadn't seemed to live up to the historical mission that Marxism had always assigned to it, which is to be kind of the universal class that leads everyone into freedom and revolution. Through their, I think, quite one-sided readings of a lot of his work, came up with an impeccably radical and Marxist justification for trying to move on from the class politics that had dominated the left for so long, since at least the 1930s in many of these countries. Stuart Hall is a very important figure in this regard, and if you read a lot of his writings on Gramsci, his emphasis in many respects is on the cultural and ideological aspects of Gramsci's work, and he uses his interpretations of Gramsci, which are culturalist, not materialist, to explain the rise of, say, Thatcherism in the UK and why she and her government was able to defeat the Labour Party in the UK, able to defeat the labor movement. People influenced by him, make similar arguments for, the rise of Ronald Reagan and the right in the US, and to try to explain why during this period you see, a number of workers in, say, the US, UK, elsewhere turning to the right politically. How do we explain this? If we, or if we accept the idea that the working class should be the battering ram of left-wing and socialist politics, why do we see, so many workers open to this kind of reactionary agenda, so on and so forth? So people are trying to explain these new developments in politics and seizing on Gramsci in order to do that. And another major work in this period that's extremely influential, and I think everyone on the left has been exposed to it, directly or indirectly in one way or another, since it was published in I think 1985, is Hegemony and Socialist Strategy by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. In the first, I think, chapter or two of the book, I think they actually do a very good job of reconstructing Gramsci's political thought and a lot of the debates around this concept of hegemony that took place during the period of the Second International, which is to say the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then they say, okay, Gramsci took the ball forward. He came up with a lot of these very interesting and useful ideas and concepts, but didn't take them to their logical conclusion. And they argue that if he took conceptions like hegemony and others to their logical conclusion, then you would have to leave behind the supposed essentialism of Marxism and class politics, drop the idea that the working class is the leading force for social change, and downgrade socialism from sort of the main project of the left to just one aspect of a multifaceted, multi-form movement for what they called radical democracy. And that argument has been extremely influential on the left. I think because, this is just a guess, a hypothesis on my part, I think for a lot of people, it seemed to speak to the defeats and failures of the left and of the labor movement, and to try to make sense of how to move forward in this new and challenging world. I don't think it's a particularly strong strategic argument for moving forward, but they're trying to grapple with a real issue and a real strategic dilemma that I think the left and labor was facing all over the world by the 70s, 80s, 90s.
And also, I guess timing was a factor in that, as you mentioned, it took the Italian Communist Party translations in the 1950s, and then later on the popularization of Gramsci in this British Marxist milieu, especially through New Left Review. So in a way, writing from the 1920s and 30s became fresher than it would have otherwise. Meanwhile, from the 1910s and 20s, Russian socialists, for instance, are talking about the yoking together of working class and peasant interests in a way that is almost indistinguishable from what Gramsci is writing about. The only difference is, it's a little bit clearer. Right? Obviously, there's many reasons for the reason why, some of Gramsci's writing is opaque, some of which might be the conditions in which he's writing it, which is, in fascist, prison cells. But it's, harder to decipher and has kind of that extra, layers of interpretation. And I think that also makes it a little bit prone to misinterpretation. So we got a question from, actually, David Broder, Jacobin's Europe editor, who asks, one of the main criticisms of the Italian communist tradition is that in the name of fighting for hegemony in institutions, they actually just sought integration and thus came to accept the ruling class order and assumptions. Do you think this is a reflection of weakness in Gramsci, or does he offer clues for how we might guard against this logic?
That's a really good question. And I mean, David is going to know a lot more than me about the specific history and trajectory of Italian communism. So I'm not going to try to get into too many kind of detailed analyses of, say, the history and political practice of Italian communism. But I think it's worth kind of stepping back for a second and, just foregrounding the fact that for Gramsci and for many of the people in and around his milieu, they were concerned above all else with remaining in contact with the masses of working people in their society. They did not want to be part of a sectarian organization, a sectarian movement that was cut off from kind of the mainstream of national life, that was cut off from the life and the experiences of working people and peasants and other popular forces in the society, because they knew that if that happened to them, they would be reduced to ineffectiveness, sectarianism, all the rest of it. And I think that is the right basic orientation to have. I was poking around before the call and was kind of skimming through the Lyon theses that Gramsci wrote, I think, together with Togliatti. And this kind of jumped out at me because at various points they're always coming back to the need to maintain contact with the masses of people. Don't cut yourself off. Don't be isolated. Go into every institution and every arena of life where working people are, and be there with them, struggle with them, organize with them, and try to build your capacity for political leadership that way. As I said, I think that's the right approach. But yeah, the tension here is that, and I think the Italian communists faced this, the German social democrats faced this during the period of the Second International. If you do succeed, I think, in building up like a large organization or set of organizations within the shell of the broader capitalist society, that is going to make people who are associated with all these institutions and organizations interested in kind of maintaining them, keeping them going just on their own terms, and not doing anything that might threaten or disrupt their ongoing existence, that would threaten their institutional or political survival in any way. So you, in those sorts of situations, start to get leery about, being too confrontational, about being too militant in ways that might invite repression upon you and upon your organizations from the state. You start to get elected to, say, office, as many Communist Party officials were throughout Italy, to local and regional government levels and institutions. And yeah, once you start getting elected to office, once you start winning the leadership of trade unions, once you start running the sort of massive cooperatives that the Italian communists ran for much of their existence, it does, I think, in a lot of respects, change your calculus in a way that remaining relatively small and isolated and cut off from kind of the everyday life of the society, it just changes. It changes, I think, your orientation. So yeah, I think it's a real dilemma. How do you maintain your participation in real life, in real politics, that has something to do with the life of the masses of everyday people, without giving up on the larger and broader project of transforming the society? I think for the most part, the left nowhere has really figured out how to do that. The Italian communists did not, the German social democrats did not. Here in the United States, we've never had the opportunity, unfortunately, to actually grapple with that dilemma. That would be a nice problem, I think, for us to have.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's going to be the fundamental limitation or contradiction that we have to continue grappling with if the left in the United States continues to grow and develop, continues to elect people to office, continues to rebuild the labor movement and all those sorts of things.
So there's one question, which is someone wants a quick definition of economism. And also, well, I guess one should tackle that first, just a quick definition of my politics.
That's a pretty good joke. So yeah, economism is, at the risk of doing violence to the concept, kind of one-sided emphasis on kind of everyday bread and butter trade union type issues and demands. So the sorts of demands or struggles that say your run-of-the-mill labor union would be raising in the context of its everyday work. Wage increases, benefit increases, work rules, those sorts of things. Outside of the workplace, it could, have to do with just sort of everyday demands regarding housing, fights over rent, fights over kind of the everyday things of daily life. And this is contrasted, in Gramsci and with, and in the Marxist tradition more broadly, over kind of more broadly political questions or demands, which have to do with the question of, say, who rules, and who gets to basically set the rules of the game, run the state, and set a broad direction for the society, affecting every single group that exists, not just your own group fighting for its own specific demands and goals, but how are you setting a broad agenda for leadership for every group and class in the society.
So there's a question about Stuart Hall and Hobsbawm's role in setting some of the framework for New Labor and the role of their interpretation of Gramsci. I think it's worth noting that Hall was not the worst offender and came around pretty quickly to oppose New Labor. And even Hobsbawm, I would recommend that everyone goes and read this address that was published in Marxism Today, Forward March of Labor Halted. It's a flawed work for quite a few reasons it's not worth getting into, but it does ask many of the right questions, even if the conclusions are a bit unsatisfactory. But I'll let you kind of tackle that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Bhaskar is right to note that it would be unfair, for example, to characterize someone like a Stuart Hall as like a Blairite or a New Labor person, because especially once it became clear what people like Tony Blair and the people and others of his ilk were trying to accomplish in the Labor Party, namely to orient itself towards middle classes, towards finance, and away from its traditional working class base, we're very vocally critical and opposed to what they were trying to do. So I think it would be unfair to make that kind of characterization or argument. But I think it's undeniable that in the late 70s and in the early 80s, they did start putting into play many of the concepts or ideas that would later be taken up by and put into the service of third way politics, both I think in the US and the UK and elsewhere. When you read some of what Hall has to say about these questions, I think where you start to see like the way in which he contributed to those sorts of developments and movements is how he starts to talk about, when he talks about, say, the economy, he starts to like put an emphasis on consumption and kind of that entire world of consumption and the cultures of consumption. He puts a lot of stress and emphasis on that, and starts to like downplay production and all that kind of stuff, which had always been sort of the part of the habitus of the labor movement. Very industrial oriented, very oriented towards the politics and struggles over work. So he starts to, and people in this sort of current start to talk a lot about the world of consumption as an arena of choice, of freedom, and what have you, and how these sorts of ideas and concepts could be more appropriate to the period that they were entering, could be kind of more appropriate as a political and strategic kind of principle for the left than kind of the older laborite notions of industrial democracy and production and struggles in the workplace and all those sorts of things. So yeah, they develop ideas that could be taken in a certain direction and are taken in a certain direction, but I think it would be going too far to say that, like, to draw a straight line from, say, Stuart Hall to Tony Blair and say, yes, Stuart Hall is the bad guy who made all of this possible.
Right. And I think critics and defenders of the old line alike in the 1980s in the UK tended to conflate the working class with just the manual working class, in part because it was just such a huge part of the population in Britain. Britain was probably the only country one of the only countries, at least, where you could say that there was a time when the manual working class was a social majority. And as such, I think it encouraged certain traditions that might have kind of seen that as more permanent. But I just dropped a link in the chat box to a Ralph Miliband kind of criticism of that milieu, the new revisionism in Britain. That's probably the most concise kind of overview. And then obviously, as you're reading it, you'll be able to see some of the original articles kind of being cited. So I guess,
if I
yeah,
could
go
say,
ahead.
just in addition to that, one of the best, I think, criticisms of what you would call the New Times current on the British left, which is what people like were part of, was written by a really interesting Marxist theorist named A.C. Vinandan. And he had an article called something like "The Hokum of New Times," or all that is solid melts into air, something to that effect. That's a really, I think, sharp and powerful criticism of the milieu around Stuart Hall and his co-thinkers. If I remember correctly, you can read that for free on the Verso Books website, like in their blog section. Really worth checking out. And he develops a very strong critique that I think is particularly powerful because he's also interested in addressing these sorts of more, say, cultural or ideological issues that they're raising, struggles against and around racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, feminism, so on and so forth. He's also very interested in addressing these questions. But he makes the case that this current is doing so in a way that's separating it out from class politics, separating it out from kind of what should be the fundamental commitments of Marxism and socialist politics. So I think that it's very effective for that reason.
So there's one question that's probably a good note to end on, which is, what is the relevance of Antonio Gramsci in particular today, if a lot of his core concepts are, like you mentioned, found in other Second International thinkers and other revolutionaries of that generation? What did you gain, let's say, particularly from reading Gramsci and from employing his thought today?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think probably I think there's a lot that you can still get out of Gramsci, his writings, and I think also the historical practice and experiences of the PCI, of the Italian Communist Party. Obviously, I don't think we're going to be able to just recreate and drop into the United States in the 21st century what they did or were able to accomplish. But there's a lot there, I think, that's interesting and generative that we should look at and draw on. And David Broder, who asked the question before, is a good person to consult for that. He's written a lot of great stuff on the history of Italian communism, worth checking out. For me, I think that probably in terms of concrete political practice, Gramsci is most useful for starting to really think through this question of class alliances and social alliances in the building of a new left-wing working class socialist movement in the United States. I think a lot of the debates and discussions that have been taking place recently around this question of the relationship of the new left in the U.S. to the professional managerial class fits into this box. In a lot of ways, what that question or that debate is driving at is precisely this question of class alliances. How do they work? What is their basis? How do you bind people who could and should be part of a bigger overall project, but may have different tendencies or interests in various ways? How do you bind them together in a coherent and forward-moving political project? So for me, it's that question of alliances, alliance building, and how you weld together potentially disparate groups of people from different backgrounds, different experiences, and who occupy different locations in the class struggle, in the class structure, but have an interest in and are interested in socialism. How do we bring them together? For me, I think that's probably the biggest reason in terms of practical politics to read Gramsci. And I think just for your own enjoyment, edification, entertainment, etc., he's also just worth reading on those terms too.
He has some great quotes. He's like a good punchline rapper. He was a papoose of his day, if you will.
You love that analogy.
Yeah. Papoose does not get enough love in 21st century socialist YouTube. So, by the way, that's what we're trying to build. So you have to press the like button, and don't blame Chris for my papoose reference. So please press the up like button, not the bad button, and subscribe to the channel. And tomorrow we have David Kalnitsky. On Saturday we have Anna Kasparian, Michael Brooks with the second episode of Weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern, and at 6 p.m. we have Megan Day. So all these should be really great talks. We're going to do a whole batch of them next week as well, all at 6 p.m. So thanks once again to Chris. I have a feeling this video is going to circulate for many years to come until the Google servers all kind of decay. So thanks for this, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you.